10 years ago, I was teaching this class in a college in the UK. It was a very progressive college. Walking towards the classroom, I could see posters on the wall against racism, for diversity. And these were students that for years they've been taught time and again how bad racism is and how discrimination is bad and all the things that you can imagine. And at some point during the class, I asked the students a simple question. What is racism? What is racism? And suddenly there's this silence in the class. These students that were so talkative all the time and participating, suddenly they felt quiet. And they started staring at each other. And they looked almost offended, like, what type of question is this? So then some of the bravest students started giving some answers, but they were not good answers. They were answers that would not go to anywhere near the essence of what racism is. They would say things like, racism is white supremacy. And I said, okay, yes, this is one form of racism, but I ask you, what is the fundamental, what is the characteristic of racism? And they couldn't give an answer. Or they would say something like, racism is when you discriminate. None of these students could even come close to tell me that racism is a form of collectivism, of tribalism, where you don't see individuals, but you judge them based on group. You just see groups. And again, these were students that they considered themselves fighters against racism. And the teachers considered themselves as good educators in terms of making their kids anti-racist. And they never bothered to give them a proper definition, a proper understanding of what racism is. And now you will ask me, how is this relevant? Why did you remember it? Well, I remember it because watching these days the protests in the American universities, but also the protests in the West, the protests in favor of actually Hamas, the protests condemning Israel, I was trying to think, what could bring a young person down to that level? What could bring a young person to that moral decadence? Moral decadence even if we go by their own standards, right? So these are the same people who've been telling us forever that how proud feminists they are. And then they watch the videos of women being massacred. They read the reports of women being sexually abused, raped, kidnapped, and they have no sympathy. These are the people who have been telling us for years how you're either a racist or an anti-racist. There's no in between. And now they side with the worst open racists. They side with the anti-Semites. They perpetuate the worst racial stereotypes, the protocols of the elders of Zion. These are the people who wave the pride flag. And yet they have nothing to say about one of the most imperialist countries in the world, Iran, who actually happens to be institutionally homophobic, as institutionally homophobic as it gets. So what brought these students to this level? And then I remember that class from 10 years ago. And I thought, these are kids who are in the middle, in the center of a very bad combination. On the one hand, they don't know how to think. They don't know how to think in principles. They don't know how to think in fundamentals. Actually, perhaps they've been told that there is no such thing as universal principles. That these principles are something that we in the West believe because it's convenient. They've been told not to judge. Who are you to judge? And even more, who are you to judge people who are oppressed, people who are different, groups that are different? So on the one hand, these kids don't know how to think. Of course, they also know zero history. And on the other hand, they have been time and again being preached, being lectured on some ideas that now lead us to the results that we see in the US campus. What are these ideas? Here's a standard one. If you're rich and if you're successful, there's something suspicious going on there. You have exploited someone. If you are Western and white and a Jew, their mind is the same as white, and you are successful, even more suspicious. Why is Israel rich and successful? Because it exploits the Palestinians. They have no other way of viewing the world. These kids are raised as little tribalists, as little racists. They see everywhere the group. They see everywhere race. Here we have the powerful whites versus these people of, I don't know if they would call them of color, but non-whites. They've been taught that the weak, the oppressed, real or imagined oppressed people, by default, they are the right side. They are the side which we have to support. Why? Because they're weak. What made them weak? Could it be because they have bad ideas, they have bad leaders? Doesn't matter. We don't ask these questions. We cannot go that deep thinking into principles. I see people who are weak, who are non-white, and on the other side I see people who are successful, who are rich, who look like white. I don't know how these people have, again, these categories in their mind. Therefore, it is clear which side we take. That's how these kids in the university campus think. And also, they've been taught that we can never judge how the, quote, oppressed act. Because remember, there are no universal principles of right and wrong. So they might commit massacres, they might kidnap babies, they might kidnap and terrorize and rape and kill women. We can't judge them. They are oppressed. They are different. It's a different culture. Who are we to say what should they be doing? So to answer the question, who unleashed these intellectual little monsters in the world? Who released this kraken of anti-Semitism, of open celebration of terror and violence? I see some answers on Twitter, some people saying, oh, there's something suspicious here because these protesters have the same tents, someone is behind these protests, someone is funding these protests. I don't believe that's where the answer lies. Who is behind these protesters? One of the most potent powers in the universe, the power of bad ideas. These kids, again, have been taught throughout their whole life a toxic combination. On the one hand, actually, they haven't been taught how to think. They don't know how to think for themselves. And at the same time, they've been taught what to think. What a dangerous mix, right? You don't know how to think, and at the same time and again, you are bombarded with these ideas. Rich, white, Jew, successful, bad. Oppressed, post-colonial, poor, good. You view the world through the groups, and the weak group is de facto on the right side. So is there any surprise that the kids react this way, celebrating Hamas and seeing that the Jews are suspicious? Of course, they have responsibility because they have free will. But this is exactly what you'd expect from people raised in that toxic combination. They can't think for themselves, and they've been given a list of allowable opinions. And now it plays in front of their eyes. Here we have the power of the evil, rich, successful, Western, versus the power versus the weakness of the exploited. They've been waiting in some way all their lives for that. It's something. Imagine a religious person, how they think about the Armageddon. It's the final battle of good versus evil. For these kids, that's what happens in front of their eyes. Again, they don't know any history. Don't ask them what happened in 48, in 56, in 67, or in Yom Kippur. They have zero idea about that. They have zero idea about that. All they see is weak group, which is post-colonial, versus strong group, which is Western. That's all they can see. And that's what brought me back to thinking this class of these kids 10 years ago. They've been taught throughout their lives about racism, and they couldn't give a very simple definition of what racism is. And this is characteristic of this whole generation. They can repeat slogans, they have this mindset, but it's completely impossible for them to think based on first principles. And of course, the fact that these kids are released in the world by bad ideas, by bad philosophy, by bad view of the world, also it can show us what is the only solution, which is to fight these ideas with better ideas, but better ideas based on first principles, based on knowledge of actual reality, of history, of what happened. What is good, what is bad. For example, the simplest thing, a society that at least tries to defend individual rights is a society that is worthy of our support. Whereas a movement that wants to establish a dictatorship is not worthy of our support. I mean, that's a starting point, right? But for these kids, that's completely impossible. Any judgment beyond the slogans that they've been taught is impossible. So once again, we find ourselves in a chaos created by bad ideas, and it's up to us to fix this with better ideas. Thanks for your time.